Nikki Austin, present. Dan Bardoff,
Present.
Rich Depree,
Present.
Terry Ellison,
Present.
Teresa Keane,
Present.
Cheryl McGuire, Dylan McGuire,
Here.
Phil Vasberg, Tim Wolf.
Present.
Okay, we have a quorum and we are in session. I'd entertain a motion to approve or amend the agenda.
I'd like to make a motion to amend the agenda, letter F in new business to add potential action item.
Okay, got a motion to amend letter F, currently an informational item, to read as a potential action item. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Motion by Cheryl and a second by Tim by voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, motion carries. I'd now entertain a motion to approve the now amended agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion by Nikki and a second by Dan. By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. We're on to consent items. Any board member wish to remove any consent item for individual consideration? Hearing none, we'll read them into the record. We're approving minutes from the Special Board of Education meeting from March 9th, 2022, and the Board of Education meeting minutes of March 14th, 2022. Approval of receipts and expenditures for February of 2022. Approval of support staff resignation, Alyssa Marsden, high school custodian. Approval of support staff hiring, Rebecca Nelson, Abraham Lincoln educational assistant. Approval of professional staff hiring, Madeline Bartles, Abraham Lincoln school psychologist. Approval of support staff transfer, Rick Alston, Abraham Lincoln custodian, part-time to full-time position. Approval acceptance of community donations, Howard and Mary Ann Johnson, $30 to the Backpack Buddies program. Monroe Women's Club, $55 and 10 grocery bags of food donated to the Backpack Buddies program. And Monroe Women's Club, $1,283 for a full scholarship for an 8th grade student to attend the middle school 2022 Washington, D.C. trip. I'd entertain a motion.
So moved. I'll second.
Got a motion by Nikki and a second by Teresa. Any additional conversation?
I have a question. The psych person that we're hiring, I'm sorry if I misread it, but is that for next year?
Yes.
That's all.
Anything else? By voice vote, signify approval by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say nay. Motion carries. We're on to public comment. We have 3 individuals here tonight to make public comment, so I'll go over a little bit of the rules of the road here real quick. So public comment is a vital part of feedback to the board, matters of importance. If you're unfamiliar, you're making a statement or a speech about your position on an item. The topic is supposed to be pertinent to the business that the board conducts and within our legitimate jurisdiction. Because our board meetings are meetings held in public and not public meetings, there wouldn't be any dialogue with you about your comment, so it's not a discussion. But it means while we may not respond directly to your comments, we'll take them into consideration as we deliberate. So we ask that you limit your comments to 5 minutes in length, and I'll keep time for you. We have first up, Joel Fonseca.
Joel Fonseca. I used to be the president at Monroe Youth Hockey. I no longer am. Tammy is now our president, so I'm going to keep mine brief because I know she's got a lot of information there. Me speaking as a past president, as a parent of a girl that is now playing, she will be playing hockey for the Fury. I know that you guys turned that down for the Monroe girls. I'm pretty sure you know, I put a Facebook post out on Facebook kind of ripping on you guys because I think you were uninformed. I think you owed it to yourself to get more information on this, because what you did is you shut down not only the one girl that did not want to play for the girls, or maybe she didn't want to, maybe it was her parents, we don't know. End of the day, there was 2 other girls that had the ability to play for that team that no longer cannot. Not that they would, but you shut that door for them as well. So I hold you all responsible and ask you that before you make a decision like this in the future, you need to get more information. Not only talking to your athletic director, who is supposed to be bringing you this information, but also working with your local youth hockey group. Because what you do, the decisions that you make at the high school level directly affects the program over here. So we're trying to build that program up. And like I said, I want to keep this brief. Another thing, I don't know if you guys have daughters, but you're gonna put your daughter out on the ice with these kids that are way bigger than me. That's a safety hazard. My daughter is about the size of Marlies, and she took a lot of good hits this year. A lot of them were very dangerous up against the boards. So just keep that in mind, that what you guys did is you allowed her to go out on the ice with these boys. They fight, a lot of cheap hits, things like that. I've witnessed a lot of this year. So again, inform yourselves, make sure you're up to date on the latest information. She's the president of Monroe Youth Hockey. You're probably gonna wanna reach out to them. If you're not getting all the information that you need from your athletic director, you better get some more information, because you're putting kids in danger. So, and like I said, you're directly affecting this group. We're trying to grow this sport. We're trying to grow your hockey program. So we need to work together as of right now, and as it has been in the past. There was always a kind of a bitter relationship between Monroe Youth Hockey and your athletic director. So we need to find a way that we can all work together. When I say we, Monroe Youth Hockey and Monroe High School, to make sure that we can grow the program on your side as well as their side. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Joel. Tammy Haight?
Hi,
Is that
Tammy
right?
Haight. Yep, that's right. I didn't know Joel was gonna be here, so some of what I'm gonna say is a little bit repetitive. And I did write mine out, because otherwise I will wander and I'll get off on tangents, which I really don't want to do. So, but just to let you know who I am the president of Monroe Youth Hockey. I am a teacher at New Glarus High School, and I'm a parent of a high school player who just finished his 14th year of playing hockey. So been around, done it, been there, done that kind of thing. But I'm here representing the youth hockey organization, and like Joel said, really with the goal of getting the high school athletic department to work together with our program and communicate any decisions that are being made at the high school level because of this unique circumstance that we have with hockey. And really what I'm here to do is trying to make things easier for everybody. I'm not trying to make things more difficult and say, oh, now you have to do an extra thing. I'm trying to make things as easy as possible. We have a lot of information at the youth level. We know what we're doing. And so we can really help the transition from kids going from youth hockey into high school. When looking at which schools to include in a co-op, there's really very little turnover in hockey. For the most part, the kids that play high school hockey have all played youth hockey, most of them for 8 to 10 years by the time they get to high school. So our hockey development coordinator does work hard to ensure that all of our players have a place to play once they have to make that transition to high school, whether that's girls or boys. Every 2 years, our hockey development coordinator compiles a list of which high schools we have represented at our youth level, the kids that will be going to high school in the next 2 years, and the number of players from each of those schools. And then gives that list to the athletic director to take to their co-op meeting. So typically this process works really well. We don't typically we never actually ask to add high schools to bring in new kids. It's always kids that have played hockey with our association, whose parents have been volunteers and have dedicated their time, money, and energy to our association. So this is the first year that we've asked for an exception to the contract from the Perrys. As Lisa told you at the last board meeting, there was some miscommunication about what year of the contract we were in. There were some COVID issues with the way that it affected Illinois sports compared to the way it affected Wisconsin sports. And of course, in our co-op, we have 4 Wisconsin schools, 4 Illinois schools, so we're really bringing from both states. So I do know that, COVID did bring a bit of an issue to some of that. But anyways, so however, we do know that it is possible to make an exception, as Belleville was added last year, which was actually the off year. With the Belleville player, that request did not come from us. So again, I can still stand by, we have never asked for an exception to be made. And when we were asked by the athletic director to take it to our board 3 years ago, in agreement with our high school coach, we voted it down because they had no affiliation with Monroe up to that point. That he had played in Verona, he was going to play in Verona. But I guess my point in saying this is that this is where the communication probably would have been helpful, because we were unaware that it was still being rescinded to the school board. So when those parents claimed that there was nowhere for their son to play, and if they weren't added, then their son would have to quit the sport he loves, that wasn't actually the case. Verona has a club high school team in addition to their WIA high school team. But they didn't let you know that. And so I know that when the decision was made, the ones that I talked to were like, well, he had nowhere to play. And I was like, well, yes, he did, because Verona has a club team. But that wasn't part of that discussion. So anyways, as you know, he quit before the season even got started, but remained in our co-op numbers. So we know that exceptions can be made, and if they're made for someone not affiliated with Monroe at all, then why wouldn't we do it for a family that's been part of our association for years, and really he's in need of a place to play. And moving to a different city, going to a different club, going to a different school, or sitting out a year just, which was suggested to them, just really aren't realistic options. So the other thing that I just wanted to mention is that, and again, this is sort of what Joel touched on, was that the decisions that are made at this level affect our youth organization. So we're here representing our youth players because eventually they're all going to play high school hockey. And so we know who's coming up, we know where they're coming from. We know that we don't have control over the high school team, and really we rent the ice to the school, we host the games. But we are very closely tied with those kids, with those players, with those families. And we just want to make sure that all sides are heard equally. For example, when the decision was made to pull out of the girls' co-op that has been in place for 10 years, Monroe Youth Hockey would have voiced that we have 15 girls in our organization who are disappointed by that decision, who have no interest in playing high school boys hockey, many of them for safety reasons, and wonder if they'll have a place to play when they all get to high school. As the communities around us are growing, it may be very difficult for us to get back into that girls' co-op. Right now, Janesville is adding a second sheet of ice. They've got 100 kids coming to their Learn to Play, which is great, right? Great numbers. But as more girls join their club, they'll have less need to co-op with other schools as well. They would not have dropped us, but now that we're out, it will be challenging to get us back in when the time comes, though we will make that fight when it happens. We know that you guys have your job to do as a board and make the best decisions for the high school. So we fully recognize that. I'm a teacher, I get it. But we do too for our youth organization. The decisions made may be in conflict for what is best for our organization, but all we're asking is that we're included in discussions or communicated with about how different situations will affect us and the consequences of making a decision one way or the other. Then you guys can make the most informed decision possible for the high school, as we would do for our program, and then we'll just respect that decision either way. But at least we know that it's been informed, and that that decision is made with all the information possible. So, thank you.
Thank you. Heidi Brandt?
Hello, I will keep this brief. My name is Heidi Brandt. I have two boys who play hockey, one at the Monroe High School level, one just completed his last year of Monroe Youth Hockey. Hockey mom and hockey player perspective, I just wanted to speak on behalf of the Perrys. This is a wonderful family, and in addition to our organization, Lisa Perry works with developmentally challenged children. She is an educator. Saul Perry is a business owner in Durand. He has coached my younger son in hockey for 3 years. I cannot say enough good things about this family. As a coach, Saul is, not only teaching the rules of the game, he's patient, he inspires the kids. He's watching out for the kids. There isn't a couple I can think of more that are champions of our kids. They have done so much for the team, the players, our rink. They have done so much for our community and our kids here. My son is in 8th grade. There are 7 kids who will be moving up to high school hockey next year. There are a couple more that are optional due to age. They can play another year of youth hockey. But these kids have played together. They are, they have their own little network. They are a brotherhood, and they would be super sad. I didn't mention Angelo. He's a great kid. He's one of their teammates. This is a team effort. They all work together to get the job done. So anyway, I just wanted to say on behalf of the moms and the kids, it would be really a disappointment if it were not an opportunity for Angelo to play hockey next year.
Thank you, Heidi. Okay, that's all we have for public comment this evening. No old business, new business. First item is approval of the 2022 through 2023 CISA 2 contract and services. This is an annual approval. Do you want to walk us through it, or?
Yeah, we have pretty minimal services that we utilize CC2 for. So we have our $3,513 is the standard membership fee paid by every district who's part of CC2. We are a part of the Jedi Virtual School, so $8,500 is our annual fee to be a participant in the school. And then in the case if we would have a blind or visually impaired student, and if we need services from them, we do participate in that on an as-needed basis. So that's pretty much been what the contract has been with them for a number of years now. Obviously, if we find a need for additional items, we can always amend our contract with them, but this would be in line with what we've done for probably the last 10 years. Or at least, probably not 10. I don't know if we've been in Jedi that long.
Approximately how many Jedi students do we have?
I don't know off the top of my head, Dan, because we actually have more this year because we have a few students who still chose that option because they were uncertain as to what
About
COVID would
10
bring.
or 50? I mean.
I honestly couldn't tell. I'll have to get back to you on that. I know our first semester bill was about 90,000, so we must have at least 15, if not 20.
Do we pay more?
Yeah, so you pay on a per child base too for the kids. That we
We
actually,
have the $8,500 for the
That's
program.
just to be in the
plus
program.
we pay for the
Yes.
students that are involved as well.
Yep.
Okay.
What's the per student cost?
It depends upon the courses that they take. So if they're a full student, then it ends up being more. If it's, but they could, for some students like in middle and high school, they can be a la carte, right? If there's a class that we don't offer that they want to take through the Jedi, then they can do a per class basis. I would say, Jeremy, I'm looking at you. What's a per class when we do an a la carte?
It's $295 per class.
Right, but if they then get to a full schedule,
It's like 2470 something,
Right.
75 per semester.
I was gonna say, I knew it was about 6,000, I think, a year basically for a full-time student.
Yeah, that 90,000 you were talking about is that mix of full-time and singleton classes.
Okay, any additional discussion? If not, I'd entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second?
Motion by Terry and a second by Dan to approve the 22 through 23 CISA 2 contract and services as recommended by administration. By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item, item B, is the approval of the purchase of the Rico Bullwall ransom care software brought forward by the Finance Committee this evening.
Yes, this came out of finance. Just my screen stopped refreshing on me, so I gotta pop back in 1 second. We just talked about this in finance. This is basically a containment software for if a ransomware situation got within our network. We obviously have our firewall and some other applications that we do to try and prevent that from happening, but should something get inside our network, this contains it so that it does not spread and infect other computers. And obviously, as we've talked about, there's been a number of attacks on schools over the last few years, some of them very close to us. Janesville, Rockford, and others who've had their basically either their financials and or student records and or all files taken over, and they had to try and get them released. And so you can either hope that you can get that released, or otherwise, basically, as the name would imply, you pay a ransom to get your control of your network back. And so the cost on this, now that I finally have my screen back. Oh, I thought I had it back.
$60,648.
Thank you, for 5 years of software services.
That's over the full 5 years, not per year.
Full 5 years. Full 5 years.
It was like 22,000.
That's 22,000 for a single year, so that's discounts as you go on.
Gotcha.
And since we know we're gonna need it, we figure we should take the discount and extend it out.
And what, do we have anything now in this?
Not that does the containment, no, we have our firewall and we have our other apps to try and make sure that anything gets in. We also segment our network within how we set our file structures up to help limit it, and so we actually tested out pretty well on it, but we don't have anything that's actively searching for files on the network constantly, so that if, somebody would plug a little, HDMI drive in, or if somebody would tap on something that would get through our firewall, through our emails, and this actively looks for that file, and when it sees that file trying to replicate itself in advance, it shuts down that device and it contains that file. So we have nothing that does that. Our file structures help prevent it from getting too far, but it could take out a big chunk of devices, but hopefully not our whole network.
The best practice for security is security in layers. So this is just an additional layer, and this specific layer is a last line of defense. So something's gotten through the firewall, it's gotten through whatever controls you have on your workstations, and it's rooting around inside your file systems. It identifies that as it moves around and then shuts down the location that is being affected.
So I didn't ask this in finance, and I should have. So I'm assuming this is also going to include all the updates needed. If 3
Yes.
years from now, they find something else that they're gonna put that in for us
Yeah,
too.
it actually, it'll continually update itself, but it's not like a firewall in the sense where it's directory based, where it's like looking for the latest, ransomware virus that's out there, and then you update your firewall to identify it. This is actually looking at your file structures and how your files are acting. And then if it sees that the file itself is acting strangely, it shuts it down and shuts down the device. So it's not like it's looking for the latest, virus updates, but obviously they'll have, updates to the app and to the software throughout, but it's a little different in that sense.
Additional questions? Entertain a motion?
So moved.
Second.
We got a motion by Nikki, and I heard Tim first, second by Tim, to approve the purchase of the RICO Bullware ransom care software in the amount of $60,648 for 5 years as recommended by the Finance Committee. Additional discussion by voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Okay, so the next item in front of us, item C, it's the approval of our initial resolution authorizing general obligation bonds in the amount not to exceed $88 million. So this is a continuation of our previous discussions on a possible facilities referendum. Last time we were at a consensus that we wanted to proceed. Administration reached out to legal counsel, got the final draft language, and also prepared the language for the motion to place it on the ballot. That's included in the agendas for us to review. At this point, we can have any additional discussion about whether or not we place the question on the November ballot. And once that's completed, we can move forward.
Yeah, so the first resolution is very much in line with what the actual question that goes on the ballot looks like. So we looked at, this language last meeting to affirm that it was in line with what we wanted. And so This resolution would be authorizing those bonds for those purposes identified, which obviously is exactly what the question has to be when you're asking your community. So will look very similar to what that actual question looks like that goes on the ballot.
Any additional discussion? The first item we would want to entertain a motion for is the approval of the initial resolution. If somebody would like to make that motion.
I'll make that motion.
Okay. Motion by Tim
I'll second.
and a second by Teresa. The motion is to approve the initial resolution authorizing general obligation bonds in the amount not to exceed $88 million as presented by Ron Olson, Business Administrator. Additional discussion. This will be a roll call vote. Nikki, would you call the roll, please?
Sure. Nikki Austin, yes. Dan Bardoff?
Yes.
Rich Deprey?
Yes.
Terry Ellison?
Yes.
Teresa Keen?
Yes.
Cheryl McGuire?
Yes.
Dylan McGuire?
Yes.
Phil Vosberg?
Yes.
Tim Wolf?
Yes.
Motion carries. Okay, the next item is approval of the resolution providing for a referendum election on the question of the approval of an initial resolution authorizing the issuance of general obligation bonds in the amount not to exceed $88 million.
Yeah, so obviously in Wisconsin, we don't have the right to go out as school districts and just approve, bonding without getting approval from our community. So even though you just approved the resolution to potentially go to bonding, we then have to go to the community and say, will you give us permission to do that? And so that's what this resolution is saying. This resolution provides for that referendum, that should the community support that referendum, then would allow you to execute that approval of the bonds that you had just had the resolution for previously. The resolution's a little longer because it does lay out, the processes that we have to go through, steps involved with that referendum election and what notifications we have to put out and things of that sort. So this is, again, the actual authority then to have us have that on the November ballot.
I would move approval.
Second?
Got a motion by Nikki and a second by Terry to approve the resolution providing for a referendum election on the question of the approval of an initial resolution authorizing the issuance of general obligation bonds in the amount not to exceed $88 million as presented by Ron Olson, Business Administrator. Any additional conversation? This also will be a roll call vote. Nikki, would you call the roll, please?
Yep. Nikki Austin, yes. Dan Bardoff?
Yes.
Rich Deprey?
Yes.
Terry Ellison?
Yes.
Teresa Keen?
Yes.
Cheryl McGuire? Dylan McGuire?
Yes.
Phil Vosberg?
Yes.
Tim Wolf?
Yes.
All right. Motion carries. Thank you, everyone. The next item on the agenda is item E. It's an informational item. We'll have a presentation on our compensation study report. Jenna Bidwell is here with us tonight from Carlson Detman. She'll lead us through this report.
Yeah,
Anything you
Jim and
wanna
I
kick
have
it
had
off
some initial discussions on this, is getting them information so that they could work through it. And Jen is here to give you an update as to where they are in their process. Hopefully get some guidance from you tonight so that they can proceed through their next steps and then eventually get you back a final product that you've been looking for. So I'll let Jenna take it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Just a little quick introduction. My name is Jenna Bidwell. I've been with the Carlson Detman team now going on 8 years. Prior to joining the Carlson Detman team, I worked for the Stevens Point Area Public School District in Human Resources and come from a long line of teachers. So very near and dear and close to the jobs and the work that we're reviewing with us. Carlson Detman Consulting was a boutique consulting firm out of the Madison area. And we were acquired by Cottingham and Butler, an insurance brokerage firm out of Dubuque back in 2018. So we're part of the larger Cottingham and Butler family. And our particular team here focuses primarily on compensation consulting, subsector, focusing primarily on public sector compensation. So That's a little bit about us and who we are, and if I can get this to.
Better wait for her to point it?
Find it someplace I can-
Probably.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if that was me or not, but we'll try this again here. So the agenda for tonight is an overview of our process. We'll talk about some of the policy pieces. As mentioned, this is an informational session, so really an opportunity for us to share with you what the work that we're doing, but also to get some feedback from you around some of these key policy decisions that will allow us to keep moving forward. We're going to talk about internal consistency, what that review looked like, why it's important, why do we do those things. We'll talk about the target market, so the competitive market in which we're measuring for compensation. There's some key decisions that need to be made around that market comparison. And then I'll show you some previews into structure design. What might the pay system look like? What it makes sense for you guys. So again, there's no decisions being made, but with the hope of getting some solid direction so that we can come back with some final recommendations. Obviously, a big part of making the decisions are going to be the financial implications. And so we won't get to any point tonight talking about that, only because we need to make some of those policy decisions up front to get us some guidance. So we can bring back a couple different options if there's some different things we need to be considering, but I just wanted to give that disclaimer up front here as we're working through the agenda for tonight. There we go. Okay. So I will walk you through each of these policy decisions here in more detail as we progress through the slide deck here. But the first one is defining the target market. So who is it that we're measuring and competing and comparing ourselves against from a compensation perspective? So we've got a broad cast of data that we've collected, but we'll talk about refining that a little bit. The second policy decision then is once we've identified what that market is, we need to make a decision about where do we want to compete in that. So most typical is when people say, we're going to compete in the middle. It's the median or the average compensation. So that's policy decision number 2 is where in the market do we want to be competing? Some organizations default to that median. It's 89% or so of organizations say they want to compete right there in the middle. But other organizations want to take a strategic lead, or financially we have to take a leg approach. So we'll talk about those different options. The third policy decision then is once we've established our market and where we want to be in it, then it's about the pay structure design. So what type of system makes sense to you? I'll show you some examples. And then the fourth policy question is going to be around how do we move from where you are today to the implementation of the new system? What does that look like? What types of options do we have? So the fourth decision here is likely one that we won't resolve until we have some understanding of the financial implications. And we understand that moving into this, but just so that's on your radar of options here and things to be considering as we work through a project like this. So a little bit about internal consistency. One of the things that we do that is perhaps a little bit different than other compensation organizations that you work with is we do balance the internal relationships. So we want to take a look and understand what does your hierarchy look like? What are the roles that you have? What are the responsibilities of those roles? And how do they compare to one another? And so what it allows us to do is take an internal perspective, and what we create is a hierarchy of positions. So the idea is that this hierarchy of positions is created that's completely independent of the performance of the people in them, which is really important. So I want to just say that one more time. When we've created this hierarchy, it is based upon the roles and the responsibilities of those roles and not the individuals performing them today, okay? So what we're able to do is provide some perspective across the organization. We can compare jobs that are really apples to oranges through the job evaluation process. I'll show you in just a minute here. And then we're also able to kind of create those hierarchies. So where there are jobs that are maybe a little more similar, we can start to create some of those job progressions and some of those promotional tracks, if you think about them in that sense. So the job evaluation system that we use is a 5-factor job evaluation system. Each of the factors is listed up there. And so what we had were job descriptions, and then in conversations with Ron, an understanding of each of the positions. And so we look at each position, and the first one is looking at thinking, challenges, and problem solving. So we want to understand What's the context, the complexity of the problems that an individual is typically responsible for resolving in each of the positions? And then what's the kind of intellectual response required to be able to resolve those problems? So that's the first factor that we're measuring. The second factor then is decision-making. So we want to understand what's the freedom to act that a position has, what type of authority is granted to that position. When they're making decisions, what's the breadth of the organization impacted? Are they making decisions that impact themselves, or are they making decisions that impact multiple departments or across the entire organization? And then the third sub-factor of decision-making is, what is the individual position's role in the decision-making process? So am I making recommendations to other people for them to make the final decisions? Am I making observations and suggestions? What is that decision-making, what role do I play in that decision-making process? So that's the second factor. The third factor then is interactions and communications. So for this factor, we're looking at what are the typical types of communications that are occurring? What type of information is being shared? And then the second half of that is, what's the outcomes or effects of that information? So am I sharing information that's causing other people to behave differently? Or am I setting policy and causing other people to follow protocol, procedures, whatever that might be? So those are the first three factors. The fourth factor is work environment. This is really kind of two pieces here, looking at what are the OSHA regulated health hazards, what type of exposures or risks for injury do we have in any given position, and then the physical requirements. So what types of physical demands does a given position have? Bless you. The fifth one then is formal prep and experience. And so for this one, what we're wanting to understand is, if we went out to recruit or hire for a position tomorrow, what are those minimum education and experience requirements that would be in place for somebody to be successful in that role? And so what we see with those job evaluations is individual ratings on each of those factors. We get total points assigned to every single position, and that's ultimately what allows us to create our hierarchy of positions. So this is draft. We're still in the works, but as it is right now, our grade order list, again, you'll see each of the positions listed here that were included for this particular study. So we've got the administrators and then kind of the professional support staff, exempt staff included in the mix. And so the way that this is established is through that job evaluation process. And so we start to get kind of groupings of positions. If we look at grade 14, for example, there's 3 positions in there. It does not mean that every single position in grade 14 were evaluated the same, but it means that the points were similar, that it fell within the point range associated with grade 14. Okay. So this is what we use to kind of create that internal perspective. How do the relationships look internally? What does that hierarchy look like? Okay. So from here, we'll work on kind of refining this or making any sort of tweaks or adjustments that we need to. Ron and I have been in touch regarding this, and so we'll continue to make adjustments as we need. This, again, is related to the job documentation and the responsibilities of the roles. And so when we're looking at this and there's more significant changes, we always want to go back to that job documentation, ensure that we have it clearly documented as to what the role is and why it may be moving where it is. Okay. Yeah.
Typically in a school district, how many categories would you have?
Oh, that's a great question. So I assume what you're asking is about the grades, right? So it really depends. Right now we've got about 16 grades for this group. What's influencing the most is the levels of roles and responsibilities. And so this is a pretty significant mix when we look at everything from the superintendent down to your high school custodial and maintenance director, right? So when we think about those roles and the responsibilities, to have 16 grades in this instance seems appropriate given the different levels of responsibility. If you were to condense this, ultimately what you end up having are perhaps broader pay ranges that don't necessarily align with the market either. So you could end up maybe overpaying or underpaying, maybe unintentionally. So I think although there may be more grades here, it gives you better guidance as to what may be appropriate from a compensation perspective.
follow-up to that. So obviously, grades, with this size group, do the grades really provide a lot of value when you're looking at these specific positions, which I assume are fairly well represented across most districts, I would guess?
So a few of them aren't, but most of them are,
Yeah, so most of them are represented in the market data. To answer your question of, are the,
Typically, when I see grades, right, you will have a lot of jobs in a particular grade in an organization so that you can, again, internal equity, right? You're trying to maintain that.
Mhm.
With this number of positions, I don't know. I guess I'll wait and see what you come up with.
Sure, no, it's a great question, because I think what we're trying to balance here is the internal relationship with the market data. So if you didn't have the grades, you could say, let's just develop a pure market system and we'll pay people around solely based upon what the market is paying. In this instance, what we're trying to do is put equal benefit or equal weight to how do you see your structure, as opposed to how does the outside see your structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
One last question
Yeah.
then would be, if we look at support staff at some point in time, would you keep them off on a separate grading list, or would you try and incorporate them or add them into this?
That's a great question. So the option would be you could head down either path. One of the things that can be helpful in utilizing a similar type of grade break and kind of this existing hierarchy, if you will, it would kind of continue downward, right, is the consistency in those job points associated with each of those grades. So that would probably be my recommendation, is to kind of build that off of it. The second piece then is, do we keep them in the same market regression, which I will show you in a minute? Probably not. So there's a couple of different ways that you can have some similarities, but also separate out those groups. So that was the kind of perspective on the internal piece. And so the second half here then is really about the external market piece and what do we do with this? So going back to those policy questions, the very first one is about our target market and who are we measuring and how are we comparing ourselves? So when we are out in the market measuring these positions, Tim, to your point, many of them are found within other districts. We want to make sure that we have a good mix of jobs. And so, like I said, we've got those in grade 10 up through the superintendent. So it's a wide range of responsibility, wide range of compensation in the market as well. We're also looking for jobs that are pretty stable in content. So a superintendent from one district to the next is going to have fairly stable responsibilities. Same thing with high school principal, et cetera. The biggest decision point here around this target market, not only about, which districts are we included in, does that make sense, but really in the box at the bottom is thinking about how do we want to blend the data. So I will show you in the next slide what some of the data sources look like, but thinking about, do we only compare ourselves to K-12? Do we pull in some private sector cross-industry data? For some of your jobs, you will only have K-12 comparisons. High school principal is only going to be found in K-12, right? But other ones, you can find matches across industry. And so thinking about this from the standpoint of where do we pull our talent from? So where are we recruiting from? Who are we maybe losing talent to? That can sometimes help guide and steer this particular question. So we'll come back to talking about the mix at the end as we're talking about some of the guidance and direction that I'm looking for from you. So when I mentioned the market data sources, as a firm, we purchase and subscribe to private survey sources. And in addition to that, we were able to access the public sector data through the custom data source. So we've got a list of school districts. We worked with Ron to identify which districts to include in the mix. There's a lengthy list of them. So the nice thing about that is when we're looking at that, no one district is going to have a heavy influence on your outcome. It's well balanced, which is really important when we're looking at it from a data perspective. And then the other data sources that we provided, the comp data, Economic Research Institute, pay factors, we were looking for kind of regional data. So going back to your question, Ron, about, if we were to add in non-exempt staff, this market shrinks and we start to look very local in terms of where the data is coming from. In this group, because of the level of roles included in it, we took a broader perspective. Okay. So the question around the policy piece is, are we comfortable with the data sources that are being used specifically around those K-12 districts? That's the first question. Are there any that we should have excluded? Should we be adding in? Hopefully not too many that we'd be adding in, but did we miss somebody? And then really that understanding of how do we want to balance that custom data with those other data sources when we have appropriate matches, when there's roles that can be found outside of just K-12. So for purposes of our initial assessment here right now, it's a 50-50 blend. So where the jobs would be found elsewhere, we've weighted the other data sources 50% and the school districts 50%. Okay. So as it is right now, we've got the list up there of the existing benchmark jobs. So we've got the benchmark jobs identified by your district's job title, the number of employees within each one of them. So most of them are single incumbent jobs. The current is going to represent the current average or actual pay if it's a single incumbent. The market estimate then is that 50th percentile or the median market. And then the market index is a measurement of your current pay compared to that market rate. So overall, your market index is sitting at about 95%. So we're just a little under the overall target market if we set our target at the median.
And so just to clarify, I think when we talked, Jen, I think most of the exempt positions, I believe you're looking at with that blended mix, correct?
Yes, so as it is right now, all of these positions are a 50-50 blend. Example being, if we look at the bottom, your high school principal obviously is just a K-12 data point. Your high school custodial and maintenance director, that's gonna be a 50-50 blend.
Right, so I think where I was getting at is I think probably on the administrative side, it's my position and maybe, I think, maybe it's just my position that's probably blended.
Actually, yes.
And then, with school and non-school. And then, certainly with, seemed like there was one more that I thought might be blended, but as I'm looking, I'm thinking not, so.
Yeah, I think you're correct. I think your role is the only role that is pulling in data sources from those other than the other professional, non-administrator specific roles. So your district nurse, your director of business services, et cetera. Okay. Any questions before we move on? Do we want to talk about this blending piece here while it's fresh and top of mind? Do we want to wait to discuss it at the end?
We'll probably wrap them all together at the same time at the end.
Okay, all right. So as of right now, again, we're sitting a little bit below that median market. So policy question number 2 is, again, oh yes.
So just to make sure I understand, the 95.1% average.
Yes.
For 95% of the median.
Yes. So just to be clear, when we set a target of a median, let's say it was reading at 100%, that would mean that we're competing at the median market, which really means we're paying better than half of the organizations out there, but half of the organizations out there are paying better than us. That's what the 50th percentile means, right? So I just want to make sure that, so we're sitting a little bit below that. So the second question here about, where do we want to align ourselves? So if we said the median market is our target, we're a little bit below that. Does that meet the organizational priorities? Is the middle of the market where we think we need to be? Does it place us in a position that's competitive enough when we're thinking about retention and recruitment efforts? Okay. So that's really the questions to be considering around that median market. I included a couple of graphics here just so you understood how we kind of combined that initial portion around the internal equity with this market data. So this is a regression analysis don't want to bore you with too many details here, but it's important just to see across the bottom are the job evaluation points. On the left-hand side then are the median market rates. Each of those red dots are going to represent one of your benchmark positions. And then ultimately what we're able to do with that gray line is draw a pay line through it. So Tim, I think it was your question before, do you need your grades? Not necessarily. This gray line, what it's going to do is provide you with more steady pay ranges as opposed to reacting to the singular pay rates. So if we just built a pay structure off of the pay rates, we'd be looking at each of those red dots and building an individualized pay range around them. Okay.
And I'm assuming that may not be needed because I'm assuming these pay ranges don't move. They move like this versus in the market, they might move.
Exactly. So it's that stability piece that you'll build by having some reliability to those pay grades. So you're right. So if we had this strictly based on market data, you'd probably be measuring the market every year, and those fluctuations to those ranges would be completely dependent upon, all of the incumbents in those benchmark positions. By creating the pay ranges, you get a bit more stability in that. You can move your structures forward on an annual basis, move it forward 2%, whatever it might be, and then come back and remeasure the market like we're doing here, maybe every 3 years or 4 years, depending on the economy. Okay. The other thing I want to just point out with this graphic here as well is the R-squared is listed up there at 0.94. Again, I mentioned most of the positions are identified as benchmark positions, but where we don't have a solid market match, what the R-squared tells us is that 94% of the variance in pay from one position to the next can be explained through that job evaluation tool. So if we have a position that's not a benchmark, how do we place it? Through that job evaluation system, you can then rely on putting it into the appropriate pay grade through this analysis. When we compare then this graphic, this is just a graphic of your current pay. So each of those blue lines then represent the either current average, if it's multiple incumbents, or the current pay for singular incumbents. And you start to just kind of get a sense of how does our current pay then compare when we run it against the job evaluation points across the bottom and then current pay along the left side. So what we end up creating then is this black line represents our current pay line. And so what we're able to do is just a little bit of a comparison. So when we say we're about 5% or so below the market, what we see is with the gray line being that market pay line and the black line being our current pay line, we're a little closer at the bottom end, closer to those grade 10 jobs. And as we climb, we tend to see a little bit more separation. Okay. So really, policy question number 2 is this gray line as a median, is this our appropriate target? Okay, so we'll come back and talk about that in a little bit here. Policy question number 3 then is going to be this pay structure and administration. So this answers the really easy question of how do I get a raise, right? So from an employee perspective, they want to understand, how do I earn more money? Answering this policy question is going to be our way of answering this. What we have to consider are the financial pressures, limitations, what do we have to work with, and also really policy direction. So when we start to see some of these examples, you'll see where do we have systems like pay for performance or performance evaluations in place? What type of systems do we have in place that would support our desired pay system? Balancing, what is that relationship between performance and pay? So there's different models that represent a different balance to this concept. I'll walk you through each of these, the step, the combination, and the performance plan here in just a minute. So the first basic pay model is going to be your tenure or your step model. This is the most common public sector pay model that's out there. It's very similar to your step and lanes of teachers, and it's really based on the concept of lifetime employment. And so your increases tend to be pretty uniform in nature, And it's predetermined, and it's oftentimes very transparent, and people understand what they need to do to receive their increases year over year, and know where they're starting and where the end looks like. In this instance, what I would say is if an organization is adopting a step structure, that we still put some sort of requirement of individuals are at least meeting expectations from a performance perspective in order to receive those step increases. So we can talk more about that as we go here. The other thing to note with the tenure models is they tend to be a bit more compact. So from the minimums to the maximums, they tend to be a little bit shorter. I'll show you a visual of that too in just a minute. The second model then is the performance model. So this is your traditional private sector, open pay, merit type system model where you have a minimum, a midpoint, and a maximum. There's really no predictability in terms of how you're going to move from year to year. And it's truly dependent upon the performance of the individual. This system oftentimes takes a bit more intention and planning from a public sector perspective in order to make sure that we're funding those performance rewards on an annual basis. With this model, what you'll tend to see is kind of the widest pay models that there are, right? So really low hiring rates, but the return on that is you have higher potential on the maximum side. And then the third option is really a hybrid between the two. And so what you'll tend to see with the hybrid models are step increments up to the midpoint or that relationship to the market. And then it becomes an open pay range after that. The pay philosophy behind the hybrid model is really from an organizational perspective, we have a commitment to get you to a market rate, but any pay beyond the market is going to be dependent upon your performance. So that's kind of the philosophy model behind the hybrid. Here's a graphic representation of those three models. So the green one is that step model. You'll notice it's the narrowest. In this particular model, those are even 2.5% increments of the control point. Those are completely customizable. So we have clients that are making these a little lopsided, where we have maybe starting at 90% with 2.5% increments and kicking it off to maybe 115% on the right-hand side. So there's customizing that can happen. We have other clients who will elect to have larger step increments on the left-hand side. So if we hire you at a minimum of 90%, maybe we're giving you 3% increments up. It doesn't quite work. Math doesn't quite work on that one. But the 3% increments up to the control point, and then maybe we slow you down to 1.5% steps beyond the control point. So again, the idea is we're making a commitment to get you more quickly to the market rate, but for longevity and trying to keep you within the system and providing some growth, we'll slow you down a little bit. So a couple of options and things to consider with the step-based model, a lot of customizing that can happen there. The purple model is that open range. You see it's the widest here. So in this model, it's a 50% range spread when we go from 80% to 120%. There's no predictability in that movement there. And then the last one on the bottom is that combination. So you see those step increments, and then it's open beyond them, that control point. And that's where the performance element would come into play.
And this would be within each grade.
So whichever model you decide, we would build that for each pay grade, yes. Yes, I highly recommend some consistency in your model design. Yep. Any questions about these three models? Okay. Lastly, if pay for performance is on the table and we want to seriously consider it, here are some things that I include in here just to ensure that we've got the tools in place to make it successful. So thinking about having centralized decision-making, having some consistency in the evaluations, in the tools, making sure that we're measuring the things that we intend to measure, wanting to ensure that the tool itself, the measurements themselves are things that we value. So there's a lot of pieces to pay for performance that we want to make sure that you've tested, that they're working for you. that the feedback chain, if you will, is working and performance is developing and improving for you. So really on the pay for performance piece, it's doable. It takes a lot of effort. And really just making sure that we've got the systems in place to make sure that it can be successful is important to consider. In addition to the base compensation review, Ron had asked us to take a look at some pay time off and some benefit cost sharing information. So I've got a little bit of supplemental information here as well. And then we'll get back to some of those policy pieces here. So on the health insurance cost sharing in particular, we had 23 districts that we were looking at and just trying to get a sense of what does that cost share look like. So it's ranging in pay from 85 to 91% of the cost of the health insurance that's being covered by districts. There's 8 districts out there that have some sort of stipulation that your premiums will increase if you don't participate in the wellness offerings or the wellness program that's in place. Here at Monroe, you guys pay 90% of the cost. The most common that we're seeing is 88%, so you're a little bit up above that. But important to know that there's 7 districts that are paying 90% or more. So, you've got a little bit of a leg up, but there are others that are doing the same.
Yeah, that was with the assumption, the percentages are with the assumption that everybody is doing the wellness. So like in our case, we're actually 80%, but if you do the wellness, we then pay 90, right? So we're at 90 because we're more than some of the flat 88s, but we still meet the intent of the law by being at 80 prior to the wellness commitment.
So the one thing I would say with taking this information, you could look at it and go, most are doing 88%. We're at 90%, that's 2% better. And we were maybe 5% below on our base comp, so we're only 3% off. And the one thing I just want to note with this is these are 2 very different pieces, right? And so at the end of the day, it's important to review them both and to have an understanding, but having an idea of kind of total rewards perspective, how do we really want to position ourselves? And then to be able to communicate that and to utilize it as a recruitment and a retention piece, because this is clearly a benefit that employees would be able to experience.
And they probably matter to different employee groups at different amounts, right?
Of course.
So obviously, right now, we're talking admin and exempt, but
Of
if you
course.
start looking at other groups.
Exactly. The one thing, at the end of the day, the one thing that I always caution, especially in the public sector, because we have this history of having really rich benefits and then maybe not having as competitive compensation. And especially in kind of the climate of today, your health insurance isn't going to put food on the table. It's not going to pay their mortgage. And so it's important to keep your benefits in check and that we're providing the type of benefits. If we want to put a premium on how rich our plan is, great. But do that knowing that that's an intentional decision. Don't do it at the expense of your base compensation plan. A little bit then on paid leave. So we had a much smaller group that had provided us some information on paid leave, but we were able to get some kind of trends out of this. Most districts are still providing that vacation and sick leave versus a combined paid time off bucket. The sick leave in particular, we're seeing 10 to 14 days of sick leave being offered. In all of the districts that provided, there's not really any relationship between tenure and the amount of sick leave. So whatever it is a standard per year. Again, most common was to see 12 days of sick leave provided for those year-round support professional and administrator roles.
And we're at what?
But 12 for exempt and professional, and 15 for admin.
And then on vacation leave, I'll break it down a little bit more in the next slide here, but just over half of the districts that had provided us data, we're seeing this kind of straight across the board, 20 to 25 days of vacation for those 260-day contract administrators, regardless of tenure. So if you've been here for 5 years, you're gonna get the same amount as somebody who is hired tomorrow. A little bit more then, so for those districts that are providing some sort of tiered approach, On the left-hand side, or I'm sorry, in the middle, what we have here are your year-round schedules and what the market average is for those other plans. So a little bit richer at the very onset and maybe a little bit slower from a progression perspective than others.
And this slide is for support staff, which it says, but I just want to point that out.
And so this, again, relatively competitive. I mean, I would say that as a whole, there's much more of an emphasis being put on paid time off, flexibility, those elements of it. And so when I look at this, I don't see any significant pieces. If anything, I think the most volatile thing that we're seeing in the marketplace is this significant variety or variance in how organizations are handling new hires. So in this mix in and of itself, we had everything from there's absolutely no time up through 20 days. So it's really like this, there's no rhyme or reason to how a lot of organizations are handling this initial response. I think the most important thing is really to take a look at yourselves, understand, is it working? Are you having difficulties, or are you having to negotiate for new hires, how much time they're having, or are you allowing for that as a negotiation tool? Those types of questions are things that I would be considering as to whether or not we need to make a change to our own.
Ron, you said this graph was for support staff, or,
Yeah,
and so what would be the exempt and the admin staff?
Let me just
Similar?
correct the slide. So the vacation was more similar to the previous slide where we're kind of a flat 20 for the most part, at least with admin, and then exempt, they do ladder up similar to support staff.
Any other questions on the paid leave? Okay. So next steps, this is really kind of wrapping up the initial talking through and sharing information as to where we are. We're working internally here to finalize the grade order list, make any final changes we need to that. But really looking for guidance from all of you on those different policy decisions. And so if we can take a moment to just pause and go back and revisit each of those, talk through them, get some guidance from all of you, answer any other outstanding questions you may have. We'll be able to continue to move this project forward for you. So before we go back to those policy questions, any general questions that any of you have? Okay, so thinking about the very first question around that target market, I'm gonna, bear with me here for one moment. I'm gonna go back to our slide that shows it. So,
I do have a question. Eventually when we do this, are we shooting for, to find a number just for like a new hire, like a starting person, a 1 year experience? Where does experience build into that?
that is a great question. So what I would say to you is that decision about how do we take experience into fact when deciding on a new hire rate is going to be a bit dependent upon the type of pay structure we decide to move on. So the reason I say that is a step structure, there are fewer options for new hires. And so we may create some recommendations that you consider, maybe the first 3 steps for somebody with little to no experience, somebody with a significant amount of experience, you may consider hiring at the control point, those types of things. With an open range system, that might look a little bit different. Maybe we would say if it's 80 to 120%, maybe we would say your target hiring range should be 80 to 87.5% or whatever that might be. So it really does depend upon what type of pay structure you have in place, but also then balancing where do your current staff fall and wanting to make sure that you've got some consistency there too. So the first policy question then was around the data sources and this blending piece. So the first question really is, in understanding the list of K-12 districts, any questions or concerns about who's been included and if there's others that should have been?
So if you're wondering who that is, that's the Badger and Rock Conference, because at the time we started this process, we were still in the Badger, we're transitioning toward the Rock. And so I think the one district that's not on there is Delavan Darien is now going to be coming into the Rock. They would be probably the only district that isn't in there that as we go forward at some point in time, we'd probably include into the bases.
There's a few that are not, right? Like Forest and Baraboo aren't in here.
Or they I don't know if they weren't in part of the data set you guys had.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and double check.
They would clearly be in the.
Yep.
Yeah,
I
they're
mean,
in
I
the,
understand in Edgewood, but Edgewood's private, so I think that's probably different.
yeah, Edgewood would not be because they are private, yeah.
I'll do a double check on DeForest and Baraboo for you.
Is this what you usually do? We don't do like geographical, like in our county, like close to us or anything either?
That's a
Or-
really good question. So this is more along the lines of how historically organizations have looked at measuring their comparables.
Okay.
Should we be considering those that are closer from a county perspective or geographical perspective? It's definitely something to be considering from a policy perspective. We describe this as kind of two different markets. So the market listed up here is probably your comparable market. So how have we looked at ourselves before? Who have we compared ourselves to in the past? What you're describing is the competitive market. And so those tend to be driven more around kind of the geographical perspective. And so are there neighboring school districts that perhaps we are competing for talent in the sense of nobody would have to move. It's relatively easy to move from one district to the next. So if that is something that is of concern, we should talk about what those other districts might be, or who those other districts might be that we should be considering in the mix.
Yeah, that sometimes is what you do when you, with varying groups, right? So, I mean, you know, I think Jenna, you know, at the start of this process, maybe it was in conversation with me, or maybe it was in the proposal, right? So, like, support staff, typically are very homogeneous, right? They're not necessarily looking for a job in a similar sized district that might be an hour or two away, right? They're probably more competitive with our immediate surrounding districts. Typically, when you're talking, certainly administrators, yes, they're usually advancing through a career based upon sizes of districts and are at levels that way more than, you know, I started in Argyle. I love Argyle. I'm not going back to Argyle, right? So, I mean, that's just reality.
Yes, that's true. And so there's definitely a much greater emphasis placed on the competitive market for non-exempt positions. Which is similar, I think when we first were talking about this slide too, I mentioned, you know, our data sources, the comp datas, the ERIs, we would look at narrowing those scopes because they are taking more of that regional perspective for that same reason. So any other districts, Baraboo and DeForest are on my list. I will confirm those. I'm hoping that we had them in the mix and it was a omission here and I apologize for that. Can we talk a little bit then about the blending piece? So, you know, Ron and I had this conversation as we were initially preparing for our discussion here tonight and thinking about the questions to be thinking about when deciding these are really around the recruitment and the retention pieces. And so when we think about administrator roles especially in K-12, those tend to come from the teacher ranks, right? It's not as common, it does happen, but it's not as common that we would see somebody coming from private sector into one of those roles. So for that reason, we may want to consider doing just the K-12 mix for the administrative roles. For the rest of the professional kind of exempt roles that we have here, then maybe having that 50-50 mix does make more sense because it's easier for individuals to transition from private sector to public sector, especially K-12, in some of those other roles. Thinking about, you know, the business services director, that may be a private sector accounting supervisor or accounting manager someplace. So there's more of that transferable skills piece when we think about that next layer that we're reviewing here. Any thoughts around the blend piece?
I agree with what you said. I think the blend would be good for, well, you say exactly what you stated there.
Okay.
Because I think those skills are transferable, private to public.
Okay.
More so than administrative.
Exactly. Okay.
Depending on how good your matches are. I'm just working with comp data. When you look at positions, right, like your business services, in the private world, I don't have that. So
Sure.
are you doing it against an accounting supervisor? Or are you doing it against you know, that's where I think the magic happens. If you're gonna use a 50-50, that seems like a lot to place on that market piece potentially,
Okay.
if you don't have exact matches or real close, you know, transferable skills.
Yep. So I think to your point as well, the other piece that helps balance this is having, there's 5 additional survey sources that are going to be looked at and reviewed. So when we say 50-50 blend, you know, it feels like a lot. The reality is that we're blending it across several different survey sources as well. And so the idea that we could have one data match that may not be the strongest, but likely being able to have more solid data in some of those other sources as well. So I think it's probably a balance. What we could do is take a look at if we did K-12 across the board and compared that to a 50-50 blend to see what sort of impact would that have, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know, it might be.
I think the challenge with that is remembering that we're then only competing with one segment of that data, right? So if we were trying to recruit cross-sectionally, cross-industry, you don't necessarily have that pulse on what's happening. I think if the 50-50 blend kind of gives you that balance of what are other districts doing and what are other industry organizations.
Yeah, I think it's gonna vary, right, by position. I think of like school nurse, certainly where at different times, we may be more competitive or less competitive with the clinics of the world. But we're also a very different work environment, right? And so, so sometimes, we may be comparing ourselves to another industry and we might not look as good compared to them. It might pull us up, but maybe it's our work environment. And at other times, it might be a school food service manager might have to have some additional skill sets compared to just a regular, a restaurant food service manager. But you're right, or Phil was right, those people do come in and out, right, and intermix.
And there's probably value there, I just don't know if the 50-50 makes sense.
Sure. And like I said, I can take a look at if we do a K-12 straight and a 50-50 blend, we can look and see is there a significant impact. Obviously by position, there might be some variance, but overall we can take a look and see.
And looking at your market index numbers, it's probably not gonna be a big difference, just
Based on those numbers. I suspect that as well. So I guess at this point I would ask, is there a desire to see that K-12 only, or could we move forward with the K-12 for admin and 50-50 blend on those other directors?
I think that would be fine. And then if you want to see for the exempt folks, though, both ways, I think if you have a chance to do that. But.
Okay. Okay. So that takes care of that first policy piece. The second policy piece then is once we've kind of figured out this target piece, the question really is, where do we want to be? Is the median market an appropriate target for you? Should we be considering something else? Again, looking at where we stand right now, we're about 5% below that. It's relatively competitive. So if I were to take kind of an overall pulse check and say, where are you? I would say you're relatively competitive. So if you said 50th percentile is where we want to be, it seems reasonable to think from an implementation perspective and growth perspective that you could manage to that.
And it doesn't matter, I mean, we could say the median, right, and still wanna go above or below.
Of course.
I mean, it just tells you where the median probably is, and then we can decide, we don't have to decide it today forever, right?
Exactly.
Where we're gonna line in that, we can say, oh, here's the median we'd like to be. I don't know, it's like a 60th percentile, or, whatever.
Exactly. So what you're telling me, if you said we want to be at the median, is what I would do then, where you see that CP on the graphic, here are the control point, that's what I would anchor your structures to. So that means that over time, that could move, that could evolve. If you wanted to take a more aggressive stance, then instead of aging your structure in line with everybody else, perhaps you're aging it a percentage faster than others, right? That would slowly move that control point beyond the 50th percentile. So it absolutely doesn't mean that whatever you choose is exactly where you have to be.
Median sets from other districts, that ties where they are versus turnover ratios.
That's a great question. I do not have where they are in thinking about turnover ratio. I think there's a lot that goes into turnover, so compensation's an element of it, but it's not the sole reason. And I would hate to get kind of convoluted in what's happening in other areas. What I can tell you in terms of what are other districts doing, that measurement, that initial market index is giving us an insight that they're a little bit ahead of where we are, right? And when we mix the public sector with the other data sources. So specific to turnover, I don't have.
So my feeling would be that we shoot for the 50th percentile as the median.
Use that as our basis for now. Okay.
And as we're gonna talk about pay structures to create the guardrails around that
Exactly.
median.
Exactly. Okay, that sounds great. So then for tonight, the last policy piece then really is around the structure piece and the type of design. So thinking about, to answer that question of how much influence should performance have on pay, where is the feeling around the type of pay structure that we should look at considering?
I think one thing that we have is we don't have one person that supervises every position. So I think that pure pay performance one, I think is a difficult piece.
I'm 100% behind with you there, Dan. I don't see that being a great model for us. The other thing I know from the handful of districts that try it is set aside everything else that you're trying to accomplish educationally as a district. Your job is to evaluate staff to decide how much they get paid, right? And that's not the number one goal of what we're trying to achieve. So I would say that doesn't make sense. You probably don't typically see we see a standardized step progression for our support staff. We even see it for our teaching staff. Not all districts are there for teaching staffs anymore. You probably don't typically see that for professional staff. I'm not telling you what you do. I'm just saying that's not what we've done. It's not what's typically done. We are probably somewhat in the hybrid mode in the sense that we usually do the CPI, and then if somebody is performing above or below, we sometimes make some slight adjustments for it. I'm not knowing how their hybrid model is going to line up, but I mean, that's more in line with what we've historically done with these groups, so. I'm not saying that's right and what you need to do, I'm just saying that's where we've been, kind of.
I mean, I like the hybrid because it allows people to be rewarded for performance, within guardrails.
Sure.
One of the things that we've always had when we hire someone for a new position, right? A lot of times we've bumped their salary up. So they're moving closer to what we think is the market. And I think that is more of the hybrid approach too, where in the early years, they have more jumps, but then it's probably slows down and then you probably more, and there's still a performance piece in there for those that are still really performing well or maybe not so performing.
Yeah, and
I like the hybrid myself.
And I wasn't part of the discussions when the board initially decided to go down the road of the evaluation, but I think that was part of what you guys were discussing was, at least this gives you kind of a barometer of where you should be starting people at, right? And so, are you starting them too low and then they're forever too low? Are you starting them, where they should be? And then you can monitor that progression based upon factors, right?
We also wanted to acknowledge that as our administrators are with us longer, if we're simply adjusting pay by CPI over time, we're not really taking into account their performance, their experience, or anything else that they're bringing to the district, so then they become possibly a flight risk, right?
And that's why we're seeing that progression, right?
Yep.
That's,
Because really the only way that they can generally get bigger pay,
Somewhere
right,
else.
is to
Go
leave.
somewhere else.
And we don't want that,
So-
right?
That, for me, I think that the hybrid model helps to address some of those things. It gives us the flexibility to make changes based on performance and to recognize that over time.
and maybe the hybrid, like Ryan was explaining, is what I was thinking, more of, here's the guardrail, right? Here's your CPI plus, whatever that is, and you can go up or down based on performance potentially.
And I know, and we'll get a chance to discuss how we evolve this over time, but If we're doing a market study every 3 years, then in between those 3 years, we likely want to adjust the ranges by CPI so that we don't fall behind in the interim. And then we right-size those ranges again once every 3 years.
Yeah, so in general, at a future meeting, we'll tell you, based upon the information you provided tonight, some of those options for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, Rich, really quick, I think that's a really important piece to keep in mind as we're thinking about designing this for you is there's really two movements that should be occurring on an annual basis. So in this combination model, as it is up there, there are some steps. And so what you would be providing to an individual is not only that step movement, but also the structure itself is going to be aging. And so to your point, if you're only aging or if you're doing only one or the other, you're not seeing any progression within the market. So we age the structure itself to keep pace with the market. So if we set the median, we're aging the structure to keep pace with the median. But the step inclusions there is to recognize that development of the individual so that they're gaining on the market. Because to your point, otherwise they would always stay within kind of that same percentage of the market. Okay. All right, so the combination model is the model I'll work with, and I'll work with Ron to bring forth some options then around that. So any last questions around pay study? Thank you, I appreciate the discussion.
What's the rough timeline when you come back?
That's a good question. So we're at the end of March. I think the intention is to bring back some recommendations here in April, is it not? Yeah, so very soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a safe drive home.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to item F. It's informational possible action. It's a discussion on the hockey co-op. We requested that administration come back and present a little more information about the public comment that we heard at the last meeting and then more comments this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to kind of walk us through that.
I'll start off because I was here 2 weeks ago when you guys gave public comment. And first off, I want to say you're exactly right. I mean, I don't know you guys, but you seem like one of those people, so it's not at all. As far as my eye, I want to acknowledge a lot more communication. I think we can find a better way to get your input on that because I know from some of the numbers that you guys talked about tonight, it seems like there's a little differences in those. So I want to acknowledge that first. So when I talked to you guys, you had said, it was due to COVID and the school was shut down and it's just a piece of paper that we have to do. So I said, yeah, I'll talk to Jeff and I'll look into that and see what we need to do. So that's what I did. And you guys said you wanted more information. So I wrote it all up in the information report there. But after looking at it, Jeff had went and sent the email to the entire co-op when it was decided that Belleville was being added. And Belleville's AD did respond because they responded saying that he was a student, your son was a student of the Durand. Oh, I'm sorry, Durand did respond, sorry. And they said he was a student of the Durand School District because there was a question of he attended there, attended home, or a combination of. So that was all fine. So, and then the other 4 schools from Illinois all responded, all got their paperwork back and everything and done with that. So the Durand AD didn't. They just, after that, saying, yep, he's a student of ours. And Jeff actually replied again and said, are you going to be able to get your stuff done by April 1st? And then there was nothing on their end. So I don't know what happened there.
Well, we talked to him and we asked him what happened with that. And he said that he was under the impression that the year to redo the co-op was this year. So I don't know if there was a disconnect or a misunderstanding and he didn't realize that it was gonna be redone last year. Cause when we talked to him, he said, there's no hurry because we're not doing this until next year.
And I can let
And
Jeff,
he said that twice to us.
I can let
so-
Jeff respond to that. So-
Yeah.
So that's the reason, when I looked at it initially, I'm like, we had the opportunity. If they would have turned everything in, you guys would have been in a co-op. We wanted you in. It wasn't us trying to keep you out.
Right, yeah, no, and I didn't think you were trying to.
Yeah, so, and it's just that the co-op goes every 2 years, and we didn't want to reopen it again this year because it is more than a piece of paper. I didn't know anything about this. I'm asking Jeff about it, and it's really going to the entire Badger Conference, having the entire conference board of ADs vote on it, approve the additions or deletions of teams, and then having the entire co-op, all 10 different schools, fill out the paperwork and go to their school board and have them ratify that as well. So that's the reason if it was a simple piece of paper, like I told you that the other night, I'm like, that seems reasonable, we should do that, right? But if it's going through that entire process, that was the reason felt we shouldn't reopen it when it could have been done the year before. If the AD that did respond would have returned that like all the other schools did.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just chime in. So we spoke a year, 13 months ago, 14 months ago. Yep, remember the conversation. And I said, yep, your child is in Maya, no problem. Co-ops are agreements between schools. I'll reach out to your AD. So when it was decided by Mr. Watsky and the board to allow Belleville to come in, provide the opportunity to add Durand as well. Sent out a mass email on March 11th to all 10 schools, all their athletic directors, about the process, all the forms, the attachments, what needs to be signed, what they need to print out, what the school board needs to sign on, everything, timeline. Your AD responded 3 days later, and to kind of lay out that he's a Durand student and homeschool a little bit, right? Is it?
Mhm.
So he laid that out, and I simply responded on the day after, on March 15th, saying, "Sounds good, thank you. You have all the paperwork. Can you complete it by April 1st?" And then he kind of went silent, gone. No response. In the meantime, I got all paperwork back from all our 9 schools. I proceeded. I informed the WIA that I have all my paperwork in except for the one school, still waiting on them. And they gave me like a 5-day extension and then they essentially cut me off and said, "Are they in or are they out?" And I said, "I can't get a hold of the guy. I guess they're not in." So, and that's where we're at now. And like Jeremy was saying, it's not a simple piece of paper. You know, it ends up being like a 24-page pamphlet or document that I have to submit and organize all these different board meetings and signatures and keep everything in order and submit it to the WIA. So I wish it was a single page piece of paper because, yeah, we would do it. But unfortunately, it's not. So that's kind of where we sit.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the conference and adding new deletion?
Yeah, I mean, the WIA has a 2-year agreement, and it's always been a 2-year agreement. It's a 2-year agreement for a reason, because it's a lot of work. They plan their divisions and the hockey season around the co-ops and the size of the co-ops. Yeah, they can be renewed every year, but it's a lot of work. If we were to keep the same teams every year, then we wouldn't have to renew. It would simply be a 1-page document if all the teams are staying the same. But when you add teams, you reset the entire process. It has to go through all the steps with all the different forms. So it's not a fun process. It's, like I said, we have a large co-op, and yeah, it's
Wasn't it done in the off year, correct, though?
last year.
Was not the year that it was supposed to have been done.
Correct,
It was
yep.
supposed to have been done this year.
Yep.
So that's kind of what all of us were following, thinking that it was gonna be done this
But
year.
that's not how it was explained to all the ADs when I reached out to them last year. I said, all right, here we
Right,
go,
but
we're
that's how it was
renewing.
explained to us. So we should have, we would have certainly gone to Durand, athletic director and said, hey, get on this. Durand was closed for a long time. They never went back to full-time
Right.
instruction last year because of COVID.
Yep.
So lots of the employees were not there.
Yep.
I have a question, Jeff. Did you contact that AD again when you didn't hear back from him, or contact these parents because they have gone to you, or contact the Joel or Tammy, whoever was in charge at the time?
Right, so like I said, so co-ops are agreements between schools, so I reached out to their AD. He did respond. In both my emails, I was pretty specific on the timeline, on the date. All the paperwork, it said for what seasons it's for the 21-22 and the 22-23 seasons. So to me, that it shows that they knew what season I was talking about, what school years I was talking about. And I emailed them twice. I don't know how many times I need to reach out to a school, what number you want me to reach out to, 3 times, 4 times. But
Jeff-
like I said, I reached out twice.
Really quick, just to clarify, he did respond or he didn't?
He did respond.
I thought up here you said he didn't respond because you told the WIA I haven't heard from him.
After the timeline, right.
Oh, so
He
you did, he
responded
did
to
respond.
I didn't get the
Right.
He
paperwork back.
responded
from him. I'm
initially, he
not getting
didn't
that.
finalize the agreement as requested through the emails.
Got it, thank you.
So, and, and they're saying that, you know, school was closed down and things like that. Like I said, he responded at one point. I don't know what happened. I feel like the ball was dropped on their court. I did what I thought was appropriate.
Can it still be done?
We got 3 days.
So my question to that then too, is regardless of being a lot of work, is there any group that you would foresee would say no? So like
I mean-
everybody puts it on their board agenda, they talk about it, boom, yes, in. Do you
Usually
foresee
how it
any of
works,
them
I
saying no,
haven't seen a co-op ever get turned down.
denied?
But I don't think all 10 schools are gonna have board meetings in the next 3 days.
And I
Can
know
we get
that.
extensions on that? You
We
started?
had a 5-day extension last year, so.
Can you explain the
I guess it's possible.
situation? I mean, can you explain their situation, or how does that work?
I mean, I can. Honestly, I don't think the WIA will care, but I can explain the situation that we need to add another school.
Here.
I didn't say I don't care, I said the WIA, I don't
Yeah,
care.
no,
WIA.
I mean, I think we need to try. I don't know about anybody else, but. And moving forward, away from this, can we, if important, if things like this, can we let the Monroe Youth Hockey Association know? Let the coaches know, let these people know too if there's something at a board meeting, just so they're aware, or are we doing that? I don't know.
All we had to do is know, we would have got
Yeah,
on
we
our-
would have gotten on everybody. I mean, when I called and I spoke to him, he even told me, you even told me that this will be done next year. So I thought, okay, we got a whole year to worry about this. We don't have to worry about it this year. So I just kind of put it on the back burner and said, okay, we'll go to you guys again next year. And I came the beginning of this school year and you said, oh, it's already done. We did it last year.
We did it last year.
I think
It's like, oh,
what was
Okay.
meant there was, we talked last year, and it was for the next year, for the next season, is what the intent was in that discussion.
when I spoke to you, it was told to me that it was being redone this year, that the co-op agreement was redone every other even year, so that it would be discussed in 2020, like now, for the next school year. And that was what was told to me from Durand as well, that we don't have to worry about this for a whole nother year. And that's what it should have been, correct? If it wasn't redone last year to let a student in.
It should-
So we're off of the typical rotation of when this should be done.
Sounds like the rotation changed because Belleville was added.
Correct,
for whatever
correct,
reason.
correct. And we were not made aware of that.
So could we get back on that same rotation and then do every 2 years and make sure we inform everyone, communication, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, but something's
There's
not,
3 schools that can be dropped off of this co-op as well, Freeport being one of them.
because then you can
which
take
we-
Belleville off again, right?
Right, we want Freeport, Argyle, and Belleville dropped.
They have no students.
Right, we have no students from those schools. So
So what
if-
division you play in, it matters for what schools are in it too.
Yeah,
Count
I will
those.
say to that, though, that's where the
Right.
conference does get a little testy about it, because people are being added and deleted often, and I do think Maya and we need to have a conversation about the purpose of a co-op. And I think there's a little disconnect right now, because most co-ops, not just
Right.
hockey, are the same schools, consistent, and you build the program through those schools. Whereas we seem to have a youth program that is doing a really good job, but it's coming from all different communities, and then we're changing the co-op to grab those schools from where the different kids are from. So, and our conference doesn't really like that, because we're changing up our co-op.
But that's the
fairly often.
unfortunate situation of being in this area.
Do they understand
I get
that? They're not okay with it, or are they okay with it?
Well, they don't like it, yeah.
They understand our
But
situation?
they are the people from Madison and these bigger schools that have the numbers from their individual schools that can support a whole high school team. We unfortunately cannot.
Right,
do that.
right.
I mean, we don't, like I said before, like, we're not adding high schools to add kids, like, oh, that kid's a good player, let's add that school, right? It's just kids who, like, we could add 5 more schools and we're not gonna get any more youth players because we're just including the kids that we've had play through our youth program, so.
So
If
Jeff,
you get another kid in from another school, you are adding other schools, right?
Well-
We are
So
adding schools, but not new kids
It's always
to
gonna
a
be
hockey
constant
program.
differently, because
Right.
wherever that kid comes from, if it's Stockton, if it's here, there are always gonna be different kids.
Right.
There
Well,
are-
I think
That's the
there are-
problem that we're talking
To
about.
a certain aspect, to a certain point,
Right.
we're under the guidance of WAHA, Wisconsin Amateur Hockey Association. they put stipulations on the area that we can pull from. It's essentially Wisconsin, Monroe School District, straight down across the state line into Illinois, because they're looking at Illinois players to a certain, they said this is.
That might be 50 schools, right? I mean, so what you're asking us to do is, to almost some degree, no matter what you guys do, we have to follow on, right? You take this kid, and then we're expected every 2 years to add schools to allow those players.
Or delete.
Or delete.
And what I'm hearing you guys.
But earlier, you were kind of complaining because we dropped from Fury, even though we weren't having any kids in the next couple
We
of years.
do have kids though coming up, so.
So you want,
No, we didn't want to be dropped from the Fury. So that was not our decision. We weren't informed on that. So that's what we were saying earlier, was that we just wanted that conversation. We didn't want to be dropped
but
from
you,
that.
you made the comment, you wanted maintain on Fury for these next 8 years or whatever, because we could have potential kids coming up. And so you just want us being to be able to hold a spot for maybe a girl that's in 4th grade, right? But now you're saying, well, we have no one from Argyle, so we're just gonna dump Argyle, right? So aren't you gonna wanna hold a spot for Argyle? Just in case another,
You can add them back on every 2 years.
I think a conversation that, will need to be had is, I agree, there needs to be a conversation between the high school and Maya. I think part of that conversation is going to have to be, what does our high school co-op look like? Is Argyle in or out? If that means we have no kids from Argyle, they stay in our co-op, and they're in our co-op, or Argyle's out of our co-op, and suddenly if you get 6 kids from Argyle, sorry, they're not in our co-op. We need to set our co-op at some point in time, and that needs to be our co-op. And I think you guys need to have that conversation to decide what communities are gonna be part of that co-op.
Well, and you're exactly right, Ron. That's what I was talking about, having that conversation. And Cheryl, I think you're on the other side of that, because you're thinking like, maybe it's no big deal every 2 years to add and delete teams wherever kids are.
Yeah, I don't
But
think
that's
we
not
wanna
way
be in the
co-ops
business of
typically in high school function.
adding and dropping Freeport whenever we have a kid or don't have a kid. We need to decide if they're with us or they're not with us.
So I think that difference in philosophy of what a co-op is
So what happens
for.
with these kids then?
Well, I have
Then
one
come
thing,
on.
like our school, just as an example, okay, we live in Davis, Illinois, which is Durand School. Our town is only 1,000 people, the whole entire town. But the subdivision we're in is separated into 2 school districts, just because of where we are on that state line. Dakota is in the co-op, and us, literally across the street, we are not. If I move across the street, my kid will then be in the co-op. But because of where we're located, we are all within the WAHA boundaries of participating in Monroe, because we live in Davis. They look at the town. They don't say kids from this school can play at Monroe. They say kids who live in this town can play in Monroe. You know what I mean? So,
WIA is.
no, I understand that, but we're in.
Yeah, that's what I'm
really
trying to.
How many towns
So-
are
so
in the
we're gonna-
right now?
No,
So
stop.
hang on a second. So I think the board's gonna need to deliberate a little bit about this. We generally don't dialogue like this with.
3 days though, just for.
Right,
We're
well, I mean,
dialoguing now.
right
I'm
now.
just concerned about
Not-
the precedent
not
we're
like
setting.
tomorrow.
We're
We're
setting
just-
precedent dialoguing with you when we haven't all year on any other public comment.
Right, so
Okay.
so we're gonna.
I'm not saying it's not important, I'm just saying we're setting precedent by what we're doing, and I'm a little concerned.
Yep, and we appreciate the input, and now we're gonna talk just a little bit about it. So in front of us, I think that the option that we have is, the possible action would be to instruct administration to try to alter the co-op. I think that's the only action that the board could take tonight. We really don't have anything in front of us to approve. So that would be, I believe, the decision that we could make as a board. I agree that at some point, we need to figure out how we get some persistence to this co-op. And if it means there's boundaries from WAHA, or we work with Maya to determine all of these schools are just gonna be in the co-op, then there's some predictability there. And if the size of the co-op grows, that we have to play in with larger schools, then that's what it is. But I think it sounds like we need to get some predictability. But that's something that I think administration can work with Maya on. So for us tonight, does anybody have any thoughts on whether or not we want to see if the administration can complete altering the co-op to add Drand? Or it sounds like there were some miscommunications and some issues in several places, but do we want to try to rectify it so that Angelo can play this year is kind of the question in front of us. So that's what I want to focus on right now.
A couple of questions, Rich, if I may. First of all, do we have a standing co-op agreement for boys, not girls, or do we have no co-op agreement currently?
So that's a question for administration to respond to. So we have the standing co-op agreements right now for hockey. We have a boys co-op agreement that does not include Durand, and we do not have one for girls.
Right, we're out of the girls after this year. I guess our other only co-op would be swimming, which has always been with New Glarus.
We don't have a boys co-op agreement.
We do.
Yeah, we do. It just doesn't include Durand.
Okay.
We changed it last year, and we want to, in order to put him in, we want to change it again, if we want to do that. Otherwise, we wait one more year and he don't get to play.
I mean, I think, my opinion is, we gotta try.
I agree.
I don't know how
I mean,
you.
I'm sorry for the extra work.
Right.
Yep,
I just don't know how you can.
There was a lot, there was a lot of miscommunication here, and we need to try, and then we need to figure this out for the future.
I also would have a suggestion. I think the youth hockey has a development coordinator. Is that correct? I mean, to me, I think that's probably the pipeline of youth hockey coming to high school. And it would be very helpful to me the next time we have a discussion that those folks are included, so we know clearly if there's a pipeline of kids coming in the next 2 years. As I recall, I think it's a 2-year agreement, isn't it?
Yes.
Because yes, Jeff.
I'll just make a comment that I do reach out to Rooney Janicki, which I believe is who you're referring to, on a yearly basis. I get the projections of numbers of kids in the schools, all the way down to the lower elementary grades every year. So that process was completed. And
Thank you.
so I don't want you to feel like I'm just kind of pulling schools from wherever. I am in coordination with them on a yearly basis.
That's great.
And that's how this process started this year, or last year.
Yeah, I think for me, I recognize that there were probably some things outside of our control. Durand's AD not responding in a timely manner, and then the confusion around the frequency that the co-op gets renewed. I'm trying to be sensitive to that, and if there's any chance at all for us to rectify it, I think we give it a shot. But I'm also trying to be sensitive to the fact that this is not how co-ops are intended to operate, right? So I'd like for you guys to think a little bit about how we can make sure that this is avoided in the future, so.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of unfortunate things that seem to have happened, but I agree with Jeremy and Ron that I think, there is, and I don't even pretend to know all the intricacies of hockey for sure, but it sounds like there's a difference in what, the youth hockey program's happening versus what a high school structured program looks like. And so I like the idea that if we have a co-op, that's the co-op. Like swimming is always New Glarus. These are always the teams for the high school co-op. And you may or may not have teams, from a specific group one year, but I think that may help. But I think that communication, so thanks for making sure that's in place.
All right, so just for our understanding, Jeff, what does that process look like? We understand that you have to then contact all of the ADs at all of the representative schools, get them to.
Ask the WA for an extension.
First ask for an extension? Okay. And so generally, what length of extension would you request? Just so that we can also plan.
I'm guessing a month, because like I said, all these have to go to board meetings of every single school district involved in the co-op.
I'm assuming they're probably all meeting tonight like we are. So at least 2 weeks.
Some meet on Mondays and Tuesdays,
Okay.
some Wednesdays.
It's dependent on the district.
But to reach out, wait, one sec, to reach out to the,
We can't dialogue, I'm sorry. Okay,
How many Monroe kids play on the team?
I mean, it varies. We're usually about 15 to 18, I believe.
So do we need an action or do we not?
so we would need a motion. A motion and a second to direct administration to try to renew the co-op and include Durand. Or actually adjust the co-op as necessary to include participants or
Apply for a new co-op is really what it is.
apply for a new
An
co-op.
application for a co-op.
If somebody would like to make that motion.
Is a motion to apply for a new co-op? Is that what we have to say? Okay.
I'll move.
I'll second.
Motion by Phil and a second by Tim.
And just a comment, thank you, Jeff, for going the extra mile. Hope this might work out for you folks.
Remember about the salary rewarding system.
Try to tie that together.
All right,
Do you want a roll call vote or do you want a regular vote?
anybody can call for a roll call. Would you like a roll call?
Sure.
Okay, we'll make it a roll call vote.
All right, you ready for me?
Yep, go ahead and call.
All right, so Nikki Austin is a yes. Dan Bardoff? Did you say something or are you thinking?
I'm thinking.
Oh, that's fine. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss you.
Take your time.
I just want to say, I'm going to vote yes, but I don't think it was right, how this whole procedure went. I think it's Duran's fault. I think it was a lot of blame on him, and he didn't do that. Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right, Terry Ellison? No, I didn't do Rich. Rich Debris.
Yes.
Terry Ellison? Yes. All right, Teresa Keen?
I'm going to vote yes too, but I agree with Dan. I think I really appreciate Jeff going above and beyond because I think you did what you needed to do before. So thank you for trying to rectify this and fix what happened.
Good. Cheryl McGuire?
Yes.
Dylan McGuire?
Yes.
All right, Phil Vosberg? And Tim Wolf?
Yes.
All right, motion carries.
Okay, motion carries. All right. We're now on to informational items, boardsmanship, administration. One item about planning for,
Yeah, just recall that the admin search folks will be here on April 11th. Talk about the profile that they've developed that they'll then be sharing with the potential candidates as to what we, or our community said was important to us. And they will also be bringing forth a slate of candidates at that time for you to consider. You'll see all candidates that they have and they'll have a slate that they'll have recommended for interviews, and then you guys get to it'll be in closed session so you can dialogue as to if there's names you want added or subtracted from that list. But the thing I really need you to keep in mind is the following week, the week of the April 18th, we'll likely be looking to set up some interviews at some point that week. So we probably won't know when that is till we have that conversation on April 11th, but just, in the back of your head as you're looking at your calendars, know that there's likely going to be a meeting or two, depending upon how big that slate of candidates is. Whether we do one full day or 2 evenings, right, of interviews that you'll have to plan on sometime that week, most likely.
Karen?
Ron, do we have an idea, like, will it be like a full day? I'm sorry. if you
Don't,
just said
I
that.
don't know.
No.
Some of it's gonna depend upon how big that slate is and they'll help us set up those interviews and structure them, but at some level it'll be dependent upon what we find out on the 11th.
Thank you.
And they've finished all of the focus groups, they've finished all the individual
Yes, so
interviews.
they're
surveys,
basically, yeah, they pulled together most of the parts, as my understanding from the call with them today, most of the parts from the focus groups that our two direct consultants did themselves. And so the one thing that they're actually waiting on, which you'd think would be the easiest part, is HYA corporate has to send them back the survey results and from all the individual surveys that were submitted to them.
Board of Education correspondence, nothing that the entire board hasn't also received in the last 2 weeks. Committee reports, Dylan?
Nothing.
Ann?
Nothing.
Terry?
The library committee met last week, and as of Thursday of last week, they were open, the library's open now. And the first 4 days, I believe the attendance was 600 and some, so a little smaller than where they were at the opening of last time after COVID, but they think those numbers will gradually go up.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you.
Nothing for me?
Teresa?
Curriculum will not meet on the 11th of April, but rather the 25th, just for people.
Tim?
Finance met this evening, went through the financials, then obviously brought forward also the ransom care software to the board committee.
Thank you. Phil?
Nothing.
Cheryl? Any agenda items for future discussion from board members? Liaison reports. Liaison contacted us. They have no questions for us. I don't see anybody here from the media. At this time, we're going to go into closed session. We will come back out from a closed session with action items, and I believe our stream will continue throughout. So I'd entertain a motion if somebody would like to make it. We'd be going into closed session per Wisconsin statute 19.85, paren 1, paren C, for the purpose of discussing the tentative agreements with MEA and Mass and an administrative hiring, and Wisconsin statute 19.85, paren 1, paren B, and paren F for the purpose of discussing an employee grievance and appeal at 8:58.
Second.
Got a motion by Teresa and a second by Nikki. It's a roll call vote. Would you call the roll, please, Nikki?
Yep. Nikki, yes. Dan?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Terry?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Cheryl? Dylan?
Yes.
Phil? Tim?
Yes.
Okay. We'll go into close in the back.
Reiterate what
back in open, and we're on item 12. This is the approval of the 22 through 23 base wage agreement with MEA. If somebody would like to make a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion by Nikki and a second by Phil. Be a roll call vote. Nikki, would you call the roll, please?
Yep, Nikki, yes. Dan,
Yes.
Rich,
Yes.
Terry,
Yes.
Teresa,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Dylan,
Yes.
Phil, Tim.
Yes.
Okay, motion carries. Item 13, approval of the 22 through 23 base wage agreement with Mass. If somebody would like to make a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Got a motion by Dan and a second by Terry. Be a roll call vote. Nikki, would you call the roll, please?
Yep, Nikki, yes. Dan,
Yes.
Rich,
I will abstain.
Terry,
Yes.
Teresa,
Yes.
Cheryl, Dylan,
Yes.
Phil, Tim.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, motion carries. Item number 14 is the approval of hiring the,
Should I have abstained? I have a husband now. No, he's exempt. He's not math now. He was math. Never
I
mind.
have
Well, I mean, that's not going on the record. I just had to ask.
Oh, no,
We don't need
we're
to say
still
that out
streaming.
loud again.
we're still streaming. We're still streaming.
Only 11 people.
Okay, number 14, approval of hiring the high school associate principal. Somebody-
Motion to approve Joshua Wilson as the Monroe High School Associate Principal beginning July 1, 2022, with a 2-year contract as recommended by Jeremy Jackson.
Okay, got a motion by Teresa
Second.
and a second by Nikki. This will be a roll call vote. Nikki, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Nikki, yes. Dan?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Terry?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Cheryl? Dylan?
Yes.
Phil?
Yes.
Tim?
Yes.
All right. We're on to item 15. Consider action on employee grievance appeal. Somebody would like to make a motion.
So moved. Second.
A motion by Phil and a second by Tim. The motion is to deny the grievance appeal, requesting that the grievance be referred to an impartial hearing officer because the grievance is not timely. It'll be a roll call vote. Nikki, would you call the roll, please?
Yep, Nikki, yes. Dan?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Terry?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Cheryl?
Yes.
Dylan?
Yes.
Phil? Tim?
Okay, motion carries. Entertain one final motion at 9:45.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
A motion by Dan and a second by Terry. By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. We are adjourned.